Sending out to you a Blackboard report. Let me hand that to everybody so that you know what I'm talking about when I give it to you. This is a report that I can print out from Blackboard from the gradebook page, which you don't have the gradebook, you just have your My Grades page. This is essentially what the My Grades page shows, with a couple of little changes that I want to explain to you. So, just a second. I really would appreciate it if you'd sit in alphabetical order so I don't have to keep walking. So everybody got one, right? Okay, so what this is this report, like I said, which basically just points out the assignments that you've completed. Now, I finally caught up on grading just this afternoon, I don't know, probably about 5 o'clock. And then I printed out this report. And if you've done any work since then, that's not reflected here. But as you look down the list here of assignments, there will be some that have scores because you've completed them, they've been graded. And then some that have a dash or a hyphen where the score should be, which means that you have not opened the assignment and done any work on it. Probably the first one that you'll see like that will be the body dimensions and cavities makeup assignment. If you were here that first day, you're not required to do that assignment, so you probably haven't done it. If you weren't here that first day, you are required to do that assignment. You might have done it, and there might be something there. Or you might not have. One difference between this report and what you see under My Grades on Blackboard is in My Grades, if you aren't required to do that assignment, it'll have a gray circle next to it showing that you're exempt. I am caught up on all the exemption things, and in fact, there's not a makeup assignment that goes with tonight, so when I went ahead and did it, I did all of the makeup assignments. There shouldn't be any that you're waiting to see. If something, a makeup assignment doesn't show you that you're exempt from it under My Grades, then you're required to do it. If you don't think that's correct, you're welcome to contact me and I'll double check my attendance with your claims of being here or not. If you see one, and the one I'm using an example here doesn't have any, but if you see one that where the score should be, it says in progress. That means that you've opened it up and you may or may not have actually started working on it, but you've opened the assignment up and not submitted it. If it's an assignment that you have multiple attempts on and it says in progress, then that means that your most recent attempt is in progress. And sometimes what people will do accidentally is they'll click on an assignment, say like a part 1 assignment, even though they've completed it to, if they wanted 10 points, for some reason they click on it again. I don't know if they're going in to look at the assignment or something like that, and then don't actually complete it. So if you see something that says in progress, that means that you've opened it up. And if it's a multiple attempt assignment, you need to go in there and redo it. Okay. If it's a timed one, then you need to start another assignment so that the in-progress one is not your most recent one. And if it's not a timed assignment, go in there and finish it. There shouldn't be anything in here with one exception that says needs grading. I said that I got caught up on all the grading. I actually did have a problem, so I'm not asking you to say anything now, but there is a person with an assignment that says in progress, and it happens to be the muscle video assignment. And if you could just, that person, at some point, talk to me. I couldn't watch that video. There was a problem. So I'd just like to be able to see it, maybe on your phone or whatever. But there shouldn't, otherwise, aside from that one, there shouldn't be anything that says needs grading. If you've done any work in, like I said, since 5 o'clock, no, it's got to be earlier than that. When did I finish this up? Okay, sometime this afternoon. I finished up. If you've done any work this afternoon, and it doesn't show that you've started it or whatever on this list, that's just because I printed this list out before you did any work. At the end, there's the scores. It has a lecture score and a lab score, and then your overall grade. The lecture score is all of the points that you've gotten in all of the lecture assignments. So any chapter assignments, the syllabus quiz, it'll include the cumulative final, which you probably haven't done yet, those sorts of things. All of those things fall into lecture. The lab assignments or the lab score is just adding up all the points you've gotten on any lab quizzes, the practicals, and the muscle video. The overall grade is a weighted average of those two. Lecture counts for 3/4 of the class, and lab counts for 1/4 of the class. So you just take your lecture grade, multiply it by 0.75, your lab grade, multiply that by 0.25, add those together, and that gives me the overall grade. So on the overall grade, you see a letter there, and in parentheses next to it is the percentage. Okay? And that's how that percentage, that overall grade percentage is calculated. Right now, the way that Blackboard's set up and the way it's been set up all semester is the scores you see there, the lecture and lab scores, and therefore the overall grade that's computed from them, reflects only work that's been completed and graded. Anything that's on the list that you have in front of you right now that has not been opened, attempted, or if it hasn't been graded yet, that's not calculated in. What I'm going to do after I shut down access to Blackboard when you come in for the practical, I'm going to switch the gradebook function to then count all of the things that haven't been completed. So the grade you see is just based on the work you've done so far, but in fact, the grade in the end is going to reflect all of the assignments. Now, as I was doing this for my day classes back on Monday morning, I had all of their grading done. I printed stuff out. I actually printed out 2 versions of what I handed out to them. The first version is like what you have, where the grade is just based on the completed work. I also went in and changed things over in the grade book and printed out the report based on if all of those assignments were factored into the grade. What happened for most of the people in the class is that whatever grade they have right now turned into an F, because all of the zeros for the stuff they haven't completed yet get factored in that way. I did this for my afternoon class. I finished their stuff up this morning and printed things out. I was running a little late, so I actually couldn't print out 2 versions of the report, which actually in the end I think was probably a better idea, because it might not make a whole lot of sense, that different version. But having it there, handing out in two versions, actually, I think serves a purpose. Too often, and by often I mean a handful of times, I get students that look at their final grade and say, wait a second, this isn't the grade I'm supposed to have. Because they look at what they have now. And you might have an A right now, but you have to finish up the work for the rest of the semester. And especially towards the end of the semester, especially with people that have put off doing some work, your grade's going to suffer. Okay? If you're trying to get everything done at the last minute, you're not going to have enough time to do everything correctly. You surely should have been keeping on top of stuff overall, over the whole semester. I'll get an email from somebody saying, I thought I had an A in this class, why do I have a C? And the answer is simply, when I finished grading everything, that's what you ended up with. It's simple mathematics. There's not really a subjective component to grading. It's just the grades that you get. The scores that you get on the assignments. It's just people will sometimes think, oh, look, I've had an A all along, and I'm going to get an A in this class. And they'll kind of fall off at the end of the semester and not put the work in that's necessary. So that other version, which I didn't print out for you, is kind of the scared straight thing. So here's what you'd have if you didn't do any more work for the rest of the semester. Okay. I didn't actually try that out with your class. I didn't have time to get around to doing that, even to look at the grades. I did it with my my afternoon class, and everybody's grade became an F, except for 3 people that had like super A's. So it's not really that telling, other than to just say that you do have quite a bit of work left to do. Keep on top of it, because it all counts towards the end of the semester. So you can use this kind of as a checklist. Anything that's not completed on here, be sure that you have it complete before everything's due at the final due date. I'm not going to, of course, make another version of this to hand out, so this is the only one you have. After you finish stuff, you can start plugging in the numbers if you want to look at it that way. But just use this as a checklist. These are the things that you have to get done before the end of the semester. Now, when is the end of the semester? Next week. Okay. So hopefully you don't have a lot of things on this list to complete. Okay. But because you only have a week left in the semester to do that stuff. So the current week folder is, this stuff here, which doesn't have any assignments in it. There's no new assignments this week. Next week's folder points to the lab practical and cumulative final folder. These 2 assignments are due. They actually have as their due date 5:30 next Wednesday. But really everything has to be completed by then. Anything on that list that you haven't completed yet has to be done by 5:30 next Wednesday. Yes, Liz.
If you do it, you just don't get to grading it by Wednesday. Is that okay? Or you have to have everything graded by next?
No. You just have to have it done by that time. Then I'm going to shut off access to Blackboard so I can complete all the grading.
Okay.
Yeah, that's when you have to have it done. Christine.
There's an assignment here that says Learning Pod Neurological Exam. Is that just a learning pod that didn't come off yet? I don't know.
Yeah, I must not have deleted it. Okay, thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, that assignment was in this folder. I deleted it, so maybe when I deleted it, I didn't delete the, what do you call that? Gradebook entry. So I'll go back and look at that. But yeah, it shouldn't be there, because that, for people that completed that, those 2 points are part of your extra credit points. So. Any questions about what I'm showing you, what you need to get done before next week? Okay. So yes, next week we will be taking the second practical. The material to prepare for that, if you haven't looked at it already, is in the folder that's now under the next week link. You have the outline and the cases. The test works exactly like the first one. So there's the online part that's 16 questions, 4 for each case. And you'll be taking the in-class one, which is 50 multiple choice questions, 12 or 13 per case. Okay? And you'll have stations set up along the outside of the room for you to answer some questions about. Not all of them, just some of them. Just like last time, it'll be exactly the same format. The only difference is the first one was about stuff up to the skeleton. This one is just about muscles and nervous system. 2 of the cases about muscles, 2 of the cases about nervous system. However, do keep in mind that there is a good bit of interaction between the nervous system and the musculature. So just because it's one of the first 2 cases about muscles doesn't mean that there's not something about the nervous system that's relevant to it. Or the second 2 cases, which are about the nervous system, might have some motor functions associated with them. Controlling motor functions, that kind of thing. So that stuff's relevant to all of the cases to some degree. But focus on what the cases are on, and what the main questions are going to be about. So one more time, any questions about what we're wrapping up with for this semester? Okay. So this week, the week folder is called Neurological Correlates. What it's really getting at is what's called the Neurological Exam. I don't call the folder that because in the past students have seen that as the title for the week and thought that meant they were taking an exam. But we're actually just talking about this exam. What the neurological exam is, whoops, I'm in the wrong section. What the neurological exam is it's a tool used in clinical settings to assess neurological function. And I like to use this here at the end of the semester kind of to help as an overview for the nervous system, because sometimes the hardest thing for students to really get a sense of is how the anatomy of the system that we've looked at, especially the regions of the cortex that I pointed out last week, correspond to the functions, especially the higher functions that are a little hard to really kind of wrap your mind around. So I want to use this exam to highlight some of this. It starts off here talking about this concept of localization of function. Now, this concept actually is partly what we were talking about last week in a very broad sense. I didn't bring up this term, but it is the basis of a lot of what I covered last week. What it basically means is certain functions, certain things that we can do with our nervous system are handled in very specific areas. So, for example, that's not right. When we were looking at the cerebrum and the different lobes, I also talked about briefly what this is showing. Each of these different areas that are highlighted in the Brodmann's areas, these were all determined by Dr. Brodmann through anatomical preparations. It was all microscopic images of brain tissue. But he found that there are all of these different areas that were anatomically distinct. And since then, we've discovered that all of these areas have physiologically distinct functions. That's kind of redundant. But for example, this area 17 that's colored in this kind of, I don't know, pinkish color, is known as primary visual cortex. That area is where we receive information from the retina, actually not directly through the thalamus, but that's the first place in the cortex where we receive that information. And we start to process that, and it's the beginning of our conscious perception of vision. Or, for example, the primary auditory cortex is this little piece of cortex in the superior temporal lobe. And that's the first place where we're processing conscious perception of sound. So those functions are localized to those particular places. I can't remember now if in the book I described this example of localization of function I'm about to get to, but let me go ahead and do this. Using functional MRI, it's possible to see where certain parts of the brain are active while things are being, actions are being performed. So I have a couple of stories that I'm going to talk about functional MRI. I talk about functional MRI in one of the boxes in the book, if you're not entirely clear on it. But basically, an MRI image is looking at some physical properties of water molecules. That's really what it's about. Water molecules behave in a certain way within a magnetic field, and the M in MRI means magnetic. So that's what we use to visualize stuff. Blood is about 50% water. So when we're doing an MRI image of the brain, where the blood is going to be evident. And in functional MRI, essentially what's happening is we look at where blood flow changes. And the assumption, which is a valid assumption, is that the parts of the brain that are most active are going to have the most blood going to them to carry oxygen and glucose and those sorts of things to that tissue. So if we put somebody in an MRI machine and we're recording activity in the brain, functional MRI activity in the brain, while they're doing something, the most active parts of the brain must be the parts that are involved in what they're doing. So a very simple procedure was performed to see where particular functions are localized in a very simple example. The patients were put in the MRI machine and they were asked to move their finger in a particular pattern. So this might not actually be it, but let's say they're asked to move their finger so that they point forward and then they point up and then they point forward and they just move their finger back and forth like that. Okay. When that happened, what was discovered was activity in some very particular parts of the brain, which were all related to this activity. The first and kind of most important part of that was activity right here. This is the precentral gyrus, the gyrus that's just in front of the central sulcus, and that's called the primary motor cortex. A cell in here that's active, or a population of cells in there that's active, is going to be sending information down the spinal cord to control the motor neuron in the spinal cord gray matter that causes muscles to contract. So the command to tell your fingers to move originates out of the primary motor cortex, which for the fingers would be right about there. The layout of the cortex is actually based on a map of the body. The lower body is going to be most medial, and then from the legs and the hip to the trunk, and then the arms and the hand laid out here, and then the face as we go further down here. So the function of moving the muscles in your finger is very specifically localized to that spot where I have the cursor on the picture. Okay. I might be off, but there's a very specific spot. When somebody's moving the contracting the muscles to move the finger like that. Also, what was found is just anterior to the primary motor cortex, in this area here, in a fairly closely adjacent region of the cortex, was also activity. This area that's kind of depicted by a bunch of little circles that pattern says that this is a anatomically unique region. And what's found functionally is that this region is involved in motor planning. And as I finish this story, the reasoning for that's going to be more obvious. But in planning the movement of moving your finger in this particular pattern that I'm describing, the premotor cortex, the planning part of the brain, has to be involved too. So both of those areas light up. Also, just adjacent to the primary motor cortex on the other side over here, activity was found. Now this is the post-central gyrus. This is what we call primary somatosensory cortex. It's where we first process our conscious perception of somatosensation, which is essentially what we call touch, but it's a little bit broader than that. When we talk about touch, we mean things like, physically touching our skin and putting pressure on it, as well as feeling the textures as we move our fingertips around on a surface, or which is kind of a vibration sense. And then temperature, pain, those kinds of things all fall under touch. But somatosensation includes all of that stuff, plus what we call proprioception. The word proprio, or the root proprio, means self. So proprioception is your sense of self. And what that means really is our sense of body position and movement. Okay? So as you're moving your finger back and forth like this part of the primary somatosensory cortex is going to be active also. Now this has a map of the body just like the motor cortex. So it starts with the legs and lower body, trunk, arm, and to the face. Okay. The area that receives information of movement of the finger as we're doing this is right next to the part of the primary motor cortex that's sending the commands to cause that movement to happen. So these two areas right next to each other are both going to be active, one representing the motor control of those muscles and the other representing the sensory feedback of that movement. Okay. They're right next to each other. And then again, like I said, in the premotor cortex, there's also an area that's active. Now, the reason we know that premotor cortex area is about motor planning is that for those people that were just told to do this with their finger and they saw all those areas light up, they were then instructed to stop moving their finger, but still think about it. So think about point up, point forward, point up, point forward. And so imagine doing this, but not actually doing it. So since they're not actually doing it, since they're not actually moving the muscles, the part of the primary motor cortex that was lit up previously is no longer lit up because there's no command to actually move the muscles. So this part of the brain is no longer active because they're not doing it. Since they're not moving their muscles, also the corresponding part of the primary somatosensory cortex, which is the feedback of that movement, isn't active either because there's no sensory feedback coming in. Okay, so those two areas are no longer active since they're not doing that anymore. But the same area in the premotor cortex is still active because they're thinking about the movement. They're performing it in their head. So we can see that the localization of function is very specific. We have the planning area, we have the execution area, we have the sensory feedback area. They're all very close together because all of those things are tied together in how we actually behave. But there is a part of the brain that's active when you're planning or thinking about doing something. And really, those neurons are active the same way, whether you're really doing the thing or not. Thinking about doing the thing or doing the thing activates that part of the brain pretty much the same way. If you really want to get too deep into thinking about what's going on here, there are parts of your brain that don't care about reality. Okay? Just thinking about doing something is going to activate them just as much as actually doing those things. So I don't want to go too far down that, but if you kind of think about that a little bit, it suggests some interesting philosophical questions about brain function. So that's an example of some very specific localization. Moving the fingers, the sensory feedback of moving those fingers, and the region for planning those movements can all be very closely identified with those spots. That's localization of function. So each of these different regions that are defined anatomically by Brodmann actually correspond to functional differences also. I've pointed out some of the main ones here and colored them in, and didn't bother pointing out all the other ones because the list kind of gets carried away. But and we don't need to know all the little different functions, but it does give you an idea of some of those functions. I'm going to come back to these pictures to talk about a couple of important functions a little later on. But back to the neurological exam. Okay. It's basically a tool to assess neurological function, and it's really good at highlighting the relationship of the anatomy of the brain with its function through this localization of function idea. Before I get here, did I skip a link? No, that link's later on. Before I get on to that next picture, I want to go back into Blackboard and go to this link here. Now, this link is essentially in the book too, but the link in the book is going to a specific place. This is going to the website that I want to talk about. This is a website that's hosted by the University of Utah School of Medicine. And it was developed by Dr. Stensas, I guess is how you pronounce it, and Dr. Larson, who's at the University of Nebraska School of Medicine. They developed this website as a teaching resource for the neurological exam. Now, they're both professors at schools of medicine, and so the point here is to help train medical students. I found this website a long time ago. I've always used it when I talk about the neurological exam and when I talk about neurological function, because it's a really well done website to relate the anatomy to the function. So down this side is a list of the different components of the neurological exam. Okay. Now there's actually 6 that are listed here, but I'm only going to concentrate on 5 of them. And in the book, I make this point. The 6th one down here is just really a subset of one of the other ones. But we have the mental status exam, the cranial nerve exam, the coordination exam, the sensory exam, and the motor exam. The gait exam is really just a subset of or related components of what's the coordination exam. And when we get to talking about that, I'll explain what that means. So back to this picture. The point of this picture is it shows which parts of the nervous system those exams target. Mental status is really looking at cerebral function. Okay. Now, it's not just the cerebrum. There are some structures that have to do with cerebral function that are in the diencephalon and that sort of thing, but it's more forebrain functions. The cranial nerve exam obviously is looking at the cranial nerves, but most of them are attached to the brainstem. Now, cranial nerve 1 is attached to the cerebrum, cranial nerve 2 is attached to the diencephalon, but 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 are all attached to the brainstem. Okay. So we usually think of it as the brainstem-oriented part of the test. Coordination is interested in cerebellar function. Okay. The cerebellum is largely important for coordinated motor function, okay. Walking a straight line, being able to talk properly, I guess that's the way I want to say it. Excuse me. I don't know, just any complex movements that have to be coordinated. And it'll be easier to explain that with some examples I'll get to later on. When I mention things like walking a straight line or talking properly, what does that make you think of? When are those kinds of functions sometimes compromised? Yeah, those are functions that are lost with alcohol. The coordination exam, you are familiar with parts of it, hopefully only indirectly, as the field sobriety test. Okay, field sobriety test is basically the coordination neurological exam, because the cerebellum is very acutely sensitive to alcohol. When we lose neurological function when we're drunk, it's because alcohol is affecting coordinated movements through the cerebellum. And then we have the motor and sensory exams. They're two separate exams as they're listed, but really together, they're looking at the spinal cord. In this picture, I have motor pointing at the anterior face of the spinal cord and sensory pointing at the posterior face. Oh, sorry, yes.
So if somebody had something wrong with their cerebrum, they would fail a field sobriety test?
Cerebellum.
They would
But-
fail it as if they were drunk?
You're oversimplifying things. The things we associate with being drunk are things that are part of the coordination exam. But if somebody has neurological deficits of the cerebellum resulting in coordination deficits, it's probably not going to present the same way as somebody being drunk. Okay. You can use the neurological exam to get at really what's the cause behind problems. And so people who are drunk are a set of results to the exam. And you can differentiate that from people with cerebellar damage with some experience with the exams. Yeah.
So what would you consider happened to that person's nervous system? Like, what would you call it? Compromise? Like, was his nervous
We'll
system?
talk about that when I get to the coordination exam in a little bit more detail. Let me just finish the overview stuff. Okay. So again, motor and sensory are about the spinal cord. The motor label is pointing at the anterior side. The sensory label is pointing at the posterior side, which actually has to do with the fact that motor functions in the spinal cord are mostly in the anterior or ventral area. Like the ventral horn, gray matter contains the neurons that control motor units in the musculature. And then the sensory functions are mostly associated with the posterior or dorsal part of the spinal cord. The dorsal root ganglion is where we find the cell bodies of sensory neurons, and they're connected to the posterior side of the spinal cord. Okay. So the 5 exams kind of cover a lot of the major portions of the brain, spinal, nervous system. Mental status is about mostly the cerebrum, but also the diencephalon. The cranial nerve is mostly about the brainstem, but also a little bit of diencephalon and just a little bit of this cerebrum. Coordination is about the cerebellum, and then motor and sensory is about the spinal cord. Okay. Now, this kind of gets to some of the questions that people were more asking because they're interested about, I don't know, beating field sobriety tests or something like that. But the next part here, sorry? The next part here is just describing the kind of things that cause neurological deficits. Probably the majority of examples of where neurological functions are compromised or very specific functions are compromised are going to be the result of circulatory problems. So probably the most, well-known version of that is a stroke, which means cerebrovascular accident. There's an ischemic stroke, which means that blood flow is restricted to an area. So the tissue stops getting oxygen and the tissue is going to die. And actually, without oxygen, central nervous system tissue will start to show signs of cell death within about 10 minutes. Then there's also a hemorrhagic stroke, which is when bleeding occurs somewhere. It's a stroke because it's affecting blood supply to parts of the brain, but what really happens in hemorrhagic stroke is that a blood vessel ruptures and bleeding occurs in a very specific place. Wherever that blood vessel was headed the downstream targets of that are not going to get their blood supply. Kind of like an ischemic stroke, but with a hemorrhagic stroke, it's not just certain areas are starved of oxygen, also other areas are flooded with blood. And that would mean that the blood-brain barrier has been compromised, and so there are all sorts of other problems that can be associated with that. But here's a couple of pictures showing a site of hemorrhagic stroke. So blood accumulation here in an MRI image. And then this is just a computer enhanced image showing the accumulation of blood in a certain area, colored so that you can kind of pick out the blood there. But it's basically this area here that's compromised. Talking about the two different types of stroke, there's ischemic and hemorrhagic. In between that, there's reference to what's called a transient ischemic attack, or a TIA. These are basically little strokes that don't last for a very long time and might not cause long-term damage. In a medical chart, TIA often is sort of a catch-all for we're not really sure what caused it, but we think it was a stroke. The thing about a TIA is that it doesn't leave any long-term evidence of damage. It doesn't kill tissue, so you can't go back and see something that's the result of it necessarily. But it'll cause problems in neurological function while it's occurring. And it'll look kind of like a stroke. It's sort of a temporary or transient stroke. Other things that can cause problems are listed in the rest here. This next section is talking about neurodegenerative diseases. So these are disease states where nervous tissue is dying off, it's degenerating. So examples of this is Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, ALS, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is human mad cow. Where was I? Multiple sclerosis and those sorts of things. Those diseases are usually fairly global or very directed at a particular set of functions. But that's where something's happening to the cells and they're dying off, usually caused by some sort of toxic insult, toxicity that causes that. Hopefully tonight I'll be talking a little bit more directly about Parkinson's disease with some stuff out of the book. If I don't get to that tonight, it's in the book, but I'll talk a little bit about an example of neurodegenerative disease that night, for that tonight. The next class of things that can cause problems are developmental disorders. This is where something happened during the development of the nervous system and it led to global problems, okay? And I actually have some examples of this sort of thing that I'll point out later on. And it talks about a few other things that I might get to talking about here if I have time. So those are the kinds of things that can cause neurological deficits. I started with talking about strokes, ischemic or hemorrhagic, because while they might not be the most numerous type, they're the ones that we usually think of as causing neurological deficits because they make for very dramatic changes very quickly. Somebody has a stroke, an ischemic stroke, they might lose a very specific function or three, with everything else seeming to be left intact. And the reason is just because the very specific location that's responsible for that particular function has been compromised by a lack of blood flow. So strokes are very common explanations for very specific neurological changes that are seen in this exam. So back to the website here. So we're not going to talk about the gait exam by itself. We're just going to pay attention to these other ones. And in fact, I don't really want to go through all the exams in a lot of detail. I actually want to go to the mental status exam stuff and use that as sort of an example of what this website can show you. So in each sub-exam that we see here, it's broken up into anatomy, normal exam, abnormal examples, quiz, and media resources. Under anatomy, for mental status, it lists the different structures in the nervous system that are related to mental status. So since this is mostly about the cerebrum, and we usually concentrate on the cerebral cortex aspect of things, there's the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe that are mentioned there. Okay. The fifth thing, which I kind of jumped over, language functions are a combination of temporal and frontal lobe functions, and I'll talk about that a little later on. So there's specific frontal lobe, specific temporal lobe information, and then the language stuff is a combination of specific parts there, and then the parietal and occipital lobes. In this website, as they're talking about this, they're also going to include some information about traps and pearls. Again, this website is for training or introducing medical students to this, which they're going to use clinically. You might use some of this stuff, but I'm not here to teach you how to use this as a clinical tool. I'm using it here so that you can understand something about neurological function. You might not ever do anything that really has to do with the neurological exam in your career, but I think it is a good way to see that, what's going on here. If you're interested, you can look at the traps and pearls part of this. I'm not going to get into it because it doesn't really matter. And in fact, I'm actually not going to go into any detail about any of this stuff directly here. But what this does is it links down to some media files that you can look at to hear an explanation. So there's an introduction video, and then there's a thing about the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, and then the language areas. If you notice, there's kind of a little void of space in the frontal lobe there that corresponds to that little area there that's in the language section. So they don't talk about the language parts in these two, and they just leave it for right here. And then there's the parietal and occipital lobes, and then traps and pearls. You're welcome to look at any of these things to get more information. I'm not going to go into them right here, but I want to talk a little bit more about what's going on. In the next part of this exam section, it has the normal exam. This lists the different tests that are performed, okay? And this, again, is for the mental status. So in going through this exam, you test a person's orientation. Do they know where they are, what day it is, that kind of thing? Do they know their name? And their memory, which to some degree, some of that stuff corresponds with memory, but also if they seem to have problems, you can test whether they remember things. And there are certain sort of common memory questions that are posed. You can test a specific type of memory called attention or working memory, which is usually memorizing things for a short time, like a phone number or a list of words or something like that, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these things are examples of, or not examples, are subtests within the mental status exam. Each one goes to a spot down below where there's a video that you can look at. Now, to explain this stuff, what I want to do is actually use the set generation exam as an example. So they update this website every so often, and so there are a few things that are slightly different. They have two buttons here, one that says view online and one that says download video. It used to have two buttons, one that said download large video, one that said download small video. So I think what they've done is they've linked to a YouTube video so you don't have to download the video, or you can download it if you want. I don't want to download it, so I'm going to go to view online. Oh, great. So it's using a video viewer program that isn't on this computer. So we're not going to go there. So you can download the videos if you want to, and I'm pretty sure I've already downloaded them on here. Oh, I bet I didn't. Yeah, they updated the this computer, so anything I downloaded before is probably gone. Oh, this does not look encouraging. The reason I'm worried about this is that I'm downloading a zip file, which is just a compressed file, And I hope that I can decompress it here. Yay, Windows will do that. Okay. Oh no, they have it password protected. Well, that really just messes everything up. So I'm trying to download these things, but actually now they make it password protected. So I could write to them and say, hey, I'm an instructor. I use your website. Can I have a password to download these things? What the heck? But I haven't done that. And they didn't used to have it under password protection. So whatever. But I do know that some of these things are on YouTube. So let's see if we can get lucky. Yes. Oh, shoot. That's not the one I want. Okay. The other video I want to show you is right here, but I don't want to show it to you just yet. So instead, we're going to try this out. Okay. What happens in the set generation video that I'm trying to download and I can't is you can kind of see in the thumbnail there are two people here. The guy in the tie is one of the people, I think the University of Nebraska guy that I pointed out. And then the other one, I'm not sure if that's the other professor that's part of this, or if she works with this doctor in his office or department or whatever. But he's performing the test on her. She's a normal example. So if I played that, then you'd see what happened. But instead, what I'm going to do for the sake of demonstrating this is I'm going to have one of you be the normal example, and I'm going to perform this with you. So who would like to be the test subject here? Come on down.
Feel sobriety?
No. Have you not been paying attention? We're doing set generation. And have a seat. So the way that this works is I'm going to ask you to generate a list of words. Now, there's a timing component of this. So let me just pull up my timing. Okay, so I'm going to give you a letter, okay? And I want you to come up with as many words as you can that starts with that letter. Do not give me any words that are proper names. So nothing that starts with a capital version of that letter.
Okay.
You understand? Okay. And I'm going to be timing this, and I'll tell you when to stop.
Okay.
So I want you to give me words that start with the letter S.
Sock, shoe, staple, sky, sandal, sail, SpongeBob,
That would be a capital.
sand, sponge, sea, seagull, skull.
Okay, I'll stop you there. The test, the timing component of the test is that
Fail.
no. That a normal person should be able to generate 10 words within a minute. Okay, and you have 11 there, and I stopped you actually at 45 seconds.
Oh,
So you're normal, at least by that
well, I
measure.
got the SpongeBob wrong.
Okay. Well, you were really struggling there for some words. But from that, you obviously came up with a number of words
Yeah.
that goes there. So thank you for participating.
All right.
Okay. So that's the sort of thing that this video would show you. And if I had the video player on this computer, I'd show that to you. If you're interested in watching it, you can see her do that. Now, when I did the video search there a second ago, where'd the videos go? There we go. I did find this link here, and this is actually the abnormal example. So I'm going to play that for you in a second. But let me go back here. So we're in the normal tests for the mental status. After a normal exam, it has an abnormal examples set. The list here is exactly the same. So these are the same tests repeated, but now the subjects are different. So the first several are all performed by the same person. The next one here, there's no picture in the thumbnail because it's actually an audio file because they don't have a video of it. Then here's a woman that does a woman that does a different test. Then here's the guy that's in the test I'm about to show you again. And then a couple of other people. So these are people that have neurological deficits and they're being tested. Now the guy that I'm about to show you, which is in this little thumbnail here, he's in a lot of these because he actually has a developmental disorder, which will probably be kind of self-evident when I play the video for you. But so he's a great example for a lot of these mental status exams because what's happened is his cerebral cortex didn't develop properly. Other parts of his brain probably work fine, but he's a good example for some of these in these videos. So I'm going to play this one, which is his version of what we just did. And I actually asked Amanda to use the letter S because that's the letter that he's going to use. So I just want to show you his results with the same set of the same parameters that I gave him. So let me just turn off on the lights so we can see this a little bit better. Oops, wrong light. There we go. And the same guy that would have been in the other video, if I could show you that, is administering the test. So here we go.
I'm going to give you a lettered alphabet, and then what I want you to do is to just give me as many words to start with that letter, okay? We'll go for a minute. The letter is the letter F. Okay. Soft, okay. Oh, okay. Okay. Don't know. Did you get anyone? No.
Okay, so he actually ended the test himself, which, what? But he got to a point where he couldn't think of any more words, and so he said he's done. And in the context of what this guy's trying to do, he's not going to force it. I would have forced you to keep going if you said, I can't think of any more. Because I needed you to give me 10 words in a minute to make it work. But he didn't. Now, actually, if I can pull up the video on there that's that I don't have the player for, I think it's closed caption. Is it? Yeah, so this says closed caption. The first word he says, I'm actually not positive what he says, but that's the only thing I can really figure out. I've listened to that over and over again. And his pronunciation's a little bit off, so I can't really tell if that's what he's saying, but it's the best I can get after, like I said, repeated viewings of this. Now, what's happened here? He's not in a hospital. He's not a patient in a hospital. Actually, the woman in the thumbnail above and the couple of thumbnails below are patients in hospitals being tested. But he was called in as a subject and probably went to the medical school to perform this on video with this guy. Same setup as the normal videos, which I wasn't able to show you. So I would imagine that he was driven to the campus, or I don't know, I doubt he drives himself, but he got to the campus somehow. And then he walked to whatever building he's supposed to go to, went inside and met the guy. He's having problems coming up with a bunch of different words because he's not consciously constraining himself beyond the test. Okay? The instructions in the test, like I gave at the beginning for Amanda, is just come up with words that start with the letter S, no proper name. He got the exact same instructions, but all of the words he came up with, and the first one, again, I'm not quite sure what he says, all seem to have to do with the fact that in his brain, he's like, these are words that have to do with what I'm doing right now. Okay. Now, sophomore school and senior, I think, are obviously going to fit with that. He's at a school. He probably saw some students that might have been a sophomore, might have been a senior there, or at least what he thought to be those. I am reading quite a bit into this, but it does fit with my imposed constraint thing. Possibly he saw an attractive student there on the campus and thought it was a sexy sophomore. Maybe. Now, it's actually a little bit surprising to use the word sophomore. I don't know necessarily that he has much experience with that specifically. And he didn't say the word student. So it doesn't really fit my story behind this, but it kind of does say things. Now, Amanda did something kind of interesting, which was to sort of mentally constrain herself a little bit too. Okay? But she wasn't stuck there. Okay, so you said sock and then shoe. Obviously, those are related words. Okay? Staple is not. However, you might have noticed the stapler right there on the desktop next to you, and that was where it came from. And then sky, not related to anything. Sandal, it's a type of shoe. Sail, maybe you went to a shoe sale recently. And then we got to the SpongeBob problem. Coming off of SpongeBob, you got sand, sponge, sea, and seagull, which are obviously all related to SpongeBob. And then you got skull, which is where things kind of took a dark turn there. But anyways, so there are little groupings of words in there that are interrelated. In fact, the normal example that I couldn't play for you, the woman does the same thing. Her first word is silly, actually, which I think is she's feeling silly doing this on video. And so that's the first word that comes to mind. And there, she says like solve, solution, I think there's another word that all fit together. So that's not abnormal for people to find one word and then find some connections in there. What's abnormal is to do that and not be able to get off of it, like he was. Okay, you found some connected words, but then, at least with a lot of struggling, we're able to move on to other words and complete this. And so the normal results would be 10 words within a minute. Right? In the normal example that I couldn't play for you, she actually gets there a lot quicker. So she's more normal than you. Well, you were called up unexpectedly and you're in front of everybody, so there's a little bit of social anxiety, I suppose, with that too. So what?
Social.
So that kind of explains a little bit of your struggling through it, but still, it's perfectly normal result. You know, you're exhibiting perfectly good activity. Now, what this test is actually directed at is frontal lobe function. Okay, so partly it has to do with what's called attention or working memory, in that we sort of keep active lists of things that we're thinking about in our frontal lobe. Right? And so you have to remember the words that you've said to some degree. And then also it's helping, the frontal lobe is helping you through the task and find how to satisfy the instructions. Okay, so it's sort of getting at those sorts of functions, which are mostly centered in frontal lobe areas. Now, this patient that I was talking about here, as you can see, he's actually the subject of several of them. Because he has this developmental disorder, he has a lot of cerebral cortex deficits, and actually it's mostly frontal lobe deficits that we see with him. He's common in a lot of the early tests in this list, kind of the first half really. And then the other half of the list, which is getting into other functions, he's not a very good example for. The frontal lobe is actually, did I talk about this last week? The frontal lobe is the last part of the brain to develop. I talk about the difference between doing the right thing and doing what you want to do. Okay. So he's probably has some frontal lobe deficits because the connections in his frontal lobe never fully developed. And so we can see some of that in these tests that are performed here. So that's, I think, a good example of what these tests are about. If you're interested, you can go into looking at other ones. I don't want to go through all of them. One, as I've discovered, I don't really have access to all the videos. We could do some YouTube searches and find more of them, but that just takes time. Actually, oh, no. So these other videos here are not videos from the same series, which is kind of unfortunate. Yeah. So these are all probably neurological exam videos, but none of them are specifically from this grouping, so I'm not going to show any more there. Where are we? You can look at the little explanations of each of these tests to see what they're getting at. I want to talk a little bit about language, but I'm not going to do it from the site here. If you're interested in seeing what the site has to say about it, go ahead and look at it more. I actually want to go into the book a little bit, and actually I want to go back to this figure here. And this is going to talk a little bit more about the localization of function along with the language centers of the brain. So last week I showed you the picture of the guy that had a split brain condition, right? Yeah, that was last week. And in that video, they said that research by Dr. Gazzaniga, who's the guy in that video, led to an understanding that language function is primarily located, or not language function, but speech production is largely found in the left hemisphere. The video didn't go on to say this, but I did afterwards, that for 90 to 95% of the population, that's true. There are some exceptions, but generally speaking, when we're looking at the left side of the brain, which is what this picture is, we see some areas that are specific to language function. The two areas are Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And Broca's area is this part right in here, which is the brown and the tan. It actually has two components to it, but the whole thing is Broca's area. And then Wernicke's area is back here, which is areas 39 and 40. They're named that way specifically because they're named after particular neuroscientists or neurosurgeons. I'm actually not that familiar with Wernicke historically, but Broca is a neurosurgeon who was located, I'm pretty sure, in the Germany area in the mid-1800s. Now, there is an amazing boom to the fields of neuroscience that came about in the mid-1800s. Now, I'm putting this in the context of a scientist learning things about the brain, but actually what I'm talking about is historically there were some really awful things going on in the world. Okay, so Broca was in Germany's area, the Germany area, but you can imagine the same sort of thing happening here in America. What was happening in America around the middle of the 1800s?
Civil War.
Yeah, we got into Civil War. Okay. In Europe, there were some other wars going on. I think the Crimean War was a little bit before the Civil War, but still mid-1800s. Warfare at that time was in this interesting kind of crossover. Earlier warfare was very regimented, not to be too much of a pun, but armies marched in a very particular way, and they used weapons that were not that destructive. Okay? And then around the mid-1800s, technology got to the point where weapons got to be very destructive, but armies were still working this regimented way. And so there were a lot of people that were just cannon fodder, okay? Which is to say they were on the front lines and they got shot at, and they were there to get shot at so that more people could come after them and do more shooting and do more dying. So the medical profession got a lot of exposure to exposed brains. Somebody would be shot with a bullet that would crack the skull, but not necessarily penetrate and kill the person. And so Broca, studying war-related injuries, noticed that patients who had damage in this particular area right here, which is now called Broca's area, always presented with the same neurological deficits. And then likewise, Dr. Vernica found that people that had damage in this area always had the same kind of deficits. Now, the deficits that I'm talking about categorically are referred to as aphasias, which means a language deficit. There are two types of aphasias that I want to talk about. There's Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia. And these are both neurological deficits that result from damage to those particular places. So let me define both of these. Broca's aphasia is a loss of speech production or a compromise of speech production. And Wernicke's aphasia is a loss of language comprehension. Now, with those explanations, when we go back to the map of the different areas, we can understand what the functions have to do with those areas, okay, how those functions are localized to those particular regions. Okay. Broca's area is in the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe is about motor function. Okay. So this is essentially the planning region of the frontal cortex for making speech. Okay. If somebody loses tissue in this area, that's going to result in an inability to produce speech. Now, it's rather unlikely that somebody's going to have a complete Broca's aphasia, because that's a pretty big piece of brain, and damage to all of that area is kind of unlikely. But if somebody got a bullet hole through their skull right here to damage that part of the brain, or if somebody had a stroke in this area, a little bit of it's going to be affected. And because of that, the person loses the ability to send instructions to the primary motor cortex that's going to control the muscles for making speech sounds. Wernicke's area back here, which is associated with language comprehension, is in this area where auditory and visual information kind of comes together. And this is a really big area, but it is taking in all this kind of information. And on the left side, it's important for making use of those sensory inputs for language comprehension. And usually Wernicke's aphasia is mostly about spoken verbal language. This part of the brain is processing sound, conscious perception of sound. It gets sent on to other areas of the brain, including in here, and that's where we start to make sense of language that we hear. And from that, when we understand what we hear, we can send signals up to tell our brain to respond and say something in reply to what we hear. So Wernicke's aphasia is when people can't understand language. Okay. Now, I've not found a really good, concise way of really demonstrating that. What I always used to say, which I've now found is not a great way of describing it, it's kind of like going to a foreign country where you don't speak the language, but thinking that you do. Okay. So imagine you go to some country and somebody's talking to you and you don't actually understand what they're saying, but you try to reply to them as if you did know what they were saying. Okay. So you just start to say words that kind of sound like the language. Okay. but you don't actually understand what you're saying because you don't understand what they're saying. You don't understand the language at all. That's how I've usually characterized it. My dad's a psychiatrist, and I was talking about aphasias with him at one time, and he said, that's not really a good representation of it. And so I said, well, okay, tell me what it's about. And he said, actually, Wernicke's aphasia people usually don't talk. Mostly because they don't understand language, and they, not understanding what they're hearing, they're not going to respond to it. They actually don't understand their own language. They can't understand what they're saying. So if they were to respond to something, what they'd hear themselves saying was just complete gibberish. So they don't want to talk in the first place because they know what it'll sound like to themselves, and they just don't want to. That's how my dad described it. So it's somewhere in there. Now, I'm not giving full credence to my dad, not because I don't believe him or trust him, but he said his own admission is he doesn't see very many of those kinds of patients, but he has some experience with it a little bit and from schooling. Broca's aphasia is a bit more common. Why that is, I'm not positive. It's just, you can find examples of Broca's aphasia a bit more. Now, I'm not going to show you this video. It's a little heartbreaking, actually. But I do want to point it out if you're interested in looking at it. If you just go into YouTube and look for Broca's aphasia, you'll get you'll get these. There's a few videos of this woman named Sarah Scott. What happened is when she was about 16 or 17, she suffered a stroke in the region of Broca's area. And so she developed Broca's aphasia, which is also known as expressive aphasia, not being able to express yourself verbally. Her mother interviewed her on video the year after it happened, or the year that it happened, whatever. And then a year later, and then a year later, which I don't see here. But so there's sort of a progression through her ability to regain some of her speaking ability. And she never loses the ability to actually speak. The problem actually is that she has trouble making certain speech sounds and saying certain words. So if you're interested, you can look up Sarah Scott or Broca's aphasia or expressive aphasia on YouTube and see some videos that her mother made. And they're really kind of nice to see. It's a good interview to give you an idea of what's going on. She tells her story. Her mother's also asking her questions, about how she's experiencing it, what's her therapy like, what she's learning about her ability to talk, and that kind of thing. It's kind of interesting. It's actually kind of personally heartbreaking to me because of what the story is talking about. It sort of hit home for me a bit much. And if you're interested in what that story is, I'll tell you about it in A&P too. But anyways, you're welcome to look at those. Interestingly, I have a student this semester who has Broca's aphasia. And his classmates aren't aware of this yet because it hasn't come up, but when that class gets to this stage, well, before we get to the stage in class, I'm going to ask him if he's okay if I talk about it with everybody. But I feel kind of bad because right now when he asks questions in class, when he talks in class, he really struggles with the language. Okay? And it just seems like a really bad stutter, or not stutter, but stammer. Okay? So he's always searching for words and that kind of thing. I feel really bad because the first day of class, if you can kind of remember how I was really sort of like talking a mile a minute back then and trying to cover a bunch of stuff, he was asking questions and slowing things down, and I didn't know that he had Broca's aphasia at the time. So I was ruder than I would have liked to have been, and I kind of cut him off and sort of second guessed where he was going to answer his questions. I've become more understanding of him, so I'm doing a better job with him. But some of his classmates who don't understand what's going on, because we haven't gotten to talk about that yet, when he's talking, I can see out of the corner of my eye a lot of eye rolling going on. So I hope that they are sufficiently humbled when they find out what's going on and the issue there. But I don't want to embarrass him if he doesn't want me to share it. But I'm actually pretty sure he'll be fine with talking about it. So it's kind of interesting. I actually have a student that I'm dealing with there. And his ability to speak is very similar to what we see, especially in the early videos for Sarah Scott there.
He was born that way?
No, actually, I think he had a car accident and he hit his head. So he told me kind of briefly what it was, and I seem to remember car accident or something like that, but I'm sure he'll explain it when we get to that in class anyways. But so that's what Broca's aphasia is about. Okay. Now, I know you're all waiting for the field sobriety test stuff, so I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about some other things that have to do with the cerebrum, and getting kind of away from the neurological exam stuff, but still talking about clinical things. And actually, it's in the book, so I want to use some stuff in the book. But we're at that nice, comfortable halfway point in the class, so we'll go ahead and take a break now, and then we'll come back and we'll finish up the stuff here. So be back in here about 10 after-ish, and we'll get started back for the second half.